Chapter 1. The man in the shadows at the far edge of the city, the streets twisted like forgotten paths, and streetlights leaned like weary old men about to collapse. It was there, just there, that this ancient apartment block stood, its gray walls mottled with rain and scarred by decades of time. Honestly, it looked like it was tired of existing. Children rarely went near it. Those who did ran so fast across the courtyard, their hearts pounding in their chests, always glancing up at the upper floors as if something could just reach out of the shadows and grab them. And in that building lived a man everyone whispered about. They just called him Zephyr. He was the city's ghost, its biggest secret. No one had a clue what he did or who he was. He had been there for years, just a quiet shadow. No friends, no visitors, no one. During the day, the apartment was lifeless. Curtains pulled tight, windows covered in dust, and maybe, just maybe, the faintest shadow of a figure would move behind them. He almost never came out before the sun went down. And when he did, it was for the bare minimum. Bread, tea, cigarettes, exchanged with mumbled words at the corner shop. It was all so strange, so unsettling. But oh, when night fell, Zephyr changed. Neighbors swore they saw him just slip into the darkness. A long coat draped over his thin frame, a battered suitcase in his hand. Sometimes the suitcase looked so light, just swinging gently as he walked, like it was empty. Other nights, it seemed impossibly heavy. It dragged at his side, forcing him to move so slowly, so deliberately, as if he was protecting a secret too fragile to drop, too precious to even show. It was gut-wrenching just watching him. Where he went, and what he carried, remained a wild mystery. He'd vanish for hours, sometimes whole nights, only to reappear at dawn with the same pale, tired, hollow look on his face. The contents of that suitcase were a never-ending source of crazy speculation. Some people thought it was filled with stolen goods. Others imagined it held treasures, forbidden relics, a kind of secret he was trying so hard to hide. Rumors started to cling to him like a second skin. A woman on the third floor. She's an old lady with a heart that beats too fast. Claimed she woke up one morning before sunrise and saw him standing in the courtyard, motionless. He was just staring at the windows as if he was counting every single life stacked above him. The sight terrified her so much she slammed her curtains shut and refused to leave her apartment for the rest of the day. She couldn't shake the image of him just standing there, so still, so silently judging everyone. A guy from the building next door had a different story. He said that one night, as he passed Zephyr's door, he could have sworn he heard music. Faint, dull, delicate, almost trembling. Old romances. Forgotten French ballads. The music stopped abruptly when he paused, leaving only this heavy, unsettling silence. It was like the sound itself was a secret, meant only for someone else. Someone unseen. It was a secret you could feel in the air. And the neighbors whispered. They couldn't help themselves. Madman, criminal, dangerous. Yet no one dared to confront him. Not a single soul. They were too scared. And then the city changed. Thefts began to sweep through the neighborhood. A slow creep at first. A pocket watch here. A silver lighter there. Little things you could easily forget about. But soon, priceless objects began to disappear. A rare violin from the Philharmonic. A jeweler's most valuable gems. An ancient chalice from a local church. Every single crime was perfect, executed with this almost artistic precision. No fingerprints, no broken locks, no traces. It was as if the thief moved like a ghost through the city. And of course, suspicion came straight back to the only person who seemed capable of such quiet cunning. Zephyr. People pictured him in their minds. This pale, quiet, solitary man walking the streets with that damn suitcase. Every single movement they had ever seen him make became evidence in their own sick imaginations, even when there was nothing concrete, nothing real. The man who lived in the shadows became a story they told in stairwells, in marketplaces, in cafes. His life, which was once so unnoticed, so forgettable, was now a puzzle, and everyone was desperate to solve it. Zephyr himself, though, was completely oblivious to the storm. He just walked his nightly routes, held his suitcase, and hummed quietly to himself. He existed in a world that no one but him could ever fully understand. And maybe, just maybe, that's exactly how he wanted it. The city watched, whispered, and waited, completely unaware that the truth about Zephyr would be so much stranger and so much more human than anyone could ever imagine. A tragedy, really, for everyone involved. Chapter 2. Whispers in the dark in every city. Rumors are so much faster than the truth. And in this one, where the fog seemed to settle into every single corner, the name Zephyr began to echo through the streets like a bad dream. At first, the whispers were small and uncertain. A missing pocket watch here, a silver lighter there. Just things that could be explained by simple carelessness. But when the thefts got bolder, a jeweler's most precious gems gone, a rare violin missing from the Philharmonic, even a centuries-old chalice from a church just vanishing without a trace. The city's imagination turned to the man with the long coat and the battered suitcase. Detective Harris was given the case. He was young, so methodical, almost annoyingly so, and he had never ever encountered a suspect as enigmatic as Zephyr. No fingerprints, no broken locks, no witnesses. Nothing. Yet, the pattern of the thefts, the timing, the sheer perfection of them, seemed impossibly linked to the quiet, solitary figure. Harris spent long, grueling nights tracing Zephyr's movements, observing him slipping silently through alleys, past darkened shop windows, pausing to glance at apartments before moving on. Everything Zephyr did could be interpreted as harmless, or totally sinister. Every single step seemed deliberate, each pause loaded with this insane meaning, yet nothing concrete ever emerged. The detective wrote everything down, noting the subtle tilts of Zephyr's head, the precise rhythm of his footsteps, the way he carried the suitcase, sometimes light, sometimes impossibly heavy, as though it contained both the weight of memory and a crushing burden. Neighbors whispered in stairwells and marketplaces, their voices low and urgent. Children dared each other to knock on his door, then ran screaming back down the steps, their hearts pounding in their ears. Shopkeepers spoke in low voices about the pale man with his strange habits. "He knows we are watching," some said, their eyes wide with fear. "He is hiding something in that room of his." The city grew restless, an agitated, fearful mob, and suspicion just solidified into a wild legend. Yet Harris could not shake a growing intuition. Zephyr was odd, strange, maybe even obsessive, but there was something in him that did not match the cold, calculating nature of the crimes. He just didn't feel like a thief. And then one foggy night, as Harris followed him along the river, he saw Zephyr pause at the bridge. He just gazed at the water, whispered words no one could hear, and then turned back toward his apartment. The detective realized in that moment that Zephyr's life, while incredibly mysterious, might be a story entirely separate from the thefts. A story of devotion, obsession, maybe even love, hidden right out in the open, while the real culprit moved unseen through the city, right under everyone's noses. It was a revelation that gave him goosebumps. Chapter 3. Watching the shadows, night fell over the city like a thick, suffocating blanket. The streetlights flickered in the mist, casting long, wavering shadows across the cobblestones and sidewalks. The air was damp, so heavy, carrying the faint scent of rain and smoke from distant chimneys. Detective Harris had grown so used to the eerie silence of these streets, the way ordinary noises seemed so distorted at night. A distant cough, the scuff of a shoe, the soft hum of an unseen motorbike. Tonight, he was following Zephyr again, more cautiously than ever, his notebook in hand, his eyes sharp for every single detail. Zephyr moved with a deliberate pace, the old suitcase swinging slightly at his side. Sometimes it looked light, almost casual, like a man on a stroll. Other times it seemed impossibly heavy, and Harris could almost feel the strain in Zephyr's posture, the slight tilt of his shoulders, as if he was carrying a burden too immense for anyone to see. Harris had been tailing him for weeks, but despite all the evidence of strange behavior, he had yet to see anything that could link Zephyr to the city's thefts. Every step, every turn, every pause was careful but completely innocent. Yet the detective couldn't ignore the pattern. It was too precise, too meticulous, too purposeful to be mere coincidence. Zephyr paused in a narrow alley, leaning against the cold wall as if he was listening. Harris ducked behind a trash bin, holding his breath, straining to hear anything. For several long minutes, Zephyr just stood there, watching the windows above, silent and so still, before he resumed his walk. Harris scribbled notes furiously, marking the time, the direction, the way Zephyr's eyes flicked toward the windows. There was no rush, no panic, no nervousness, just a kind of patience. An almost obsessive patience that both intrigued and unnerved Harris. As Zephyr moved along the riverbank, the fog thickened, curling around the iron railing, swirling like a living, breathing thing. Harris watched him stop and gaze across the water at the barely visible skyline. Zephyr's face was pale and gaunt in the lamplight, but there was something in his eyes, a quiet intensity, an inward focus, a thoughtfulness that suggested he carried a life entirely different from what the city imagined. Harris wondered, not for the first time, what it would be like to see the world through Zephyr's eyes. Later, as Zephyr passed under a street lamp, he paused to glance back as if he sensed he was being followed. Harris froze, his heart pounding in his throat, careful not to make a sound. Zephyr's expression didn't change. No fear, no suspicion, only the faintest acknowledgement of the detective's presence. It was as though he knew, somehow, that Harris was there, and had already decided it didn't even matter. For the rest of the night, Zephyr moved through the streets in silence, stopping at familiar corners, inspecting empty doorways, lingering outside apartments whose residents had reported items missing in recent weeks. Each observation, Harris realized, could have been 1,000 different things. Each pause could mean curiosity, habit, or even a form of quiet ritual. Nothing about Zephyr screamed guilt. And yet, the thefts continued, occurring simultaneously with Zephyr's nocturnal wanderings, always without a trace, always flawlessly executed. Harris began to see the subtle genius of whoever was behind the crimes. The real thief didn't need to hide. They simply let the city suspect the wrong man. Zephyr's life, mysterious and obsessive, provided the perfect smokescreen. Back in his small apartment, Harris replayed the night in his mind. He pictured Zephyr moving slowly through fog and shadow, carrying his suitcase, pausing thoughtfully at empty windows, whispering words no one could hear. There was no malice in him. No crime. Only a strange devotion to his own invisible purpose, and a patience so profound, it almost seemed unnatural. Yet the detective could not dismiss the tension, the city's palpable fear, the perfect thefts. The puzzle remained a tantalizing mystery. Zephyr was the man they watched, the man they whispered about, the man who seemed to exist between reality and myth. And Harris understood that to catch the real criminal, he would have to see beyond Zephyr's shadow, beyond the suitcase, beyond the city's false assumptions. The night stretched on, the streets empty, the fog thick and curling. Zephyr finally disappeared into the apartment block, silent as a ghost, leaving Harris with only his notes, his observations, and the growing horrible realization that the truth about this man and the crimes haunting the city was far stranger than anyone could imagine. Chapter 4. Inside the apartment, Detective Harris had followed Zephyr for weeks, tracing every step through the fog-laden streets, every turn down narrow alleyways, every pause outside apartments where items had disappeared. And yet nothing, absolutely nothing, concrete linked the pale man to the thefts. Something about him had always suggested mystery, but never, ever malice. Tonight, however, Harris made a choice. He needed to see inside Zephyr's world, to glimpse what lay beyond the suitcase and the shadowy exterior. He approached the apartment block quietly, his heart thudding in his chest like a drum. The stairwell smelled faintly of old paint and dust, and the light above flickered weakly, casting trembling shadows along the wall. With careful, shaking hands, he climbed to Zephyr's floor, trying so hard to stay silent, trying to become part of the night itself. Zephyr's door loomed ahead. It was unremarkable, yet somehow it commanded all of his attention. Harris's fingers hovered over the handle, hesitant. And then, with the softest turn, he entered. The apartment was small, yet every surface seemed alive with some unseen purpose. Boxes lined the walls, stacked so meticulously, each one labeled in neat handwriting. Harris at first expected to find stolen goods, some hidden trove of treasures taken from the city. But as his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he realized there were no valuables of any criminal sort. Instead, the boxes contained gifts, letters, photographs, journals, and scrapbooks. Just fragments of a life built for someone else. On the table near the window, dozens of photographs were arranged in a precise order, each one capturing the same woman in fleeting moments of life, laughing in sunlight, caught unawares by a passing rain, reading quietly in a café, the corners of her lips curling into a smile that seemed almost eternal. Harris felt a chill go through him. Each photograph, each folded letter, each small handcrafted item, a carved wooden figure, a delicate scarf, spoke of a devotion so deep it bordered on obsession. Zephyr's life was entirely, achingly centered on this woman. The detective moved slowly through the apartment, careful not to disturb anything. On the far wall, small shelves held notebooks filled with handwritten poems. Some were long and meditative. Some were brief yet piercing with emotion. Harris read snippets, feeling the tremor of the man's heart through the ink. "If only your laughter could reach me through these walls," one began. "Even in your absence, I breathe in your shadow." Zephyr was no criminal. He was a man who lived entirely for love. A solitary figure constructing an invisible world around someone he had cherished, perhaps lost, perhaps never truly possessed. Harris's mind raced. The city had misjudged him completely. All the whispers, all the fear, all the suspicion, none of it reflected the truth. Zephyr had carried the suitcase not to hide ill-gotten treasures, but to transport tokens of devotion. Letters. Small gifts. Reminders of someone who mattered more than his own life. As Harris examined the apartment further, he noticed a chair pulled close to the window, worn, but so inviting, with a notebook resting on its arm. Zephyr had written in it, day after day, a chronology of memories, thoughts, hopes, and quiet meditations. A candle burned faintly on the windowsill, its wax pooled like frozen tears. Harris could almost see the man there writing, pausing to stare at the city, thinking of the woman who inhabited every corner of his life. It was so tragic in a way. A life of such profound love and patience, existing completely out of reach, unseen and unacknowledged. Harris knew now that the thefts and the city's fear were a red herring. Zephyr was not the criminal. He was the perfect cover. Someone else had exploited the mystery surrounding him, relying on the city's assumptions, the neighbors' whispers, the wild myths that had grown around his strange nightly ritual. Zephyr, for all his oddities, was innocent. And yet his innocence did not diminish the weight of his loneliness. Harris left the apartment with a new understanding. The man was not dangerous, not guilty, but extraordinary in his devotion, obsessive yet beautiful in his constancy. He had lived a life entirely for another, and in doing so, had become a figure of quiet legend, misunderstood by everyone who did not take the time to see his heart. Outside, the fog clung to the streets like a curtain, as if it was shielding the city from a truth too tender for daylight. Zephyr, somewhere inside, continued his nightly rituals, his suitcase by the door, writing, arranging, loving in silence. And Harris, stepping back into the night, knew that understanding Zephyr's world was only the beginning. The real story, the one of thefts and shadows, was still unfolding, and the man in the apartment, quiet and obsessive, remained the heart of a mystery that no one could yet fully grasp. Chapter 5. The heart of Zephyr. The city had grown so much quieter in the early hours, but Detective Harris couldn't sleep. He replayed every single moment he had observed Zephyr, every detail of his nightly walks, every pause in the alleys, every glance toward apartments whose residents had reported missing items. He thought of the suitcase, always by Zephyr's side, sometimes swinging lightly, sometimes dragging, as if it was weighted by invisible burdens. Nothing, Harris realized, could match the intensity of the man's inner life, hidden from the eyes of the entire world. Zephyr's life, Harris now understood, was built not on crime but on devotion, an intricate architecture of longing and love, painstakingly preserved over years. It was almost too much to comprehend. Zephyr moved through his apartment as though he was guided by invisible hands. Every letter folded, every photograph placed with care, every small gift arranged with meticulous attention, spoke of a life entirely for another person. A woman whose memory inhabited every corner, every shelf, every piece of paper. He whispered softly to himself as he worked, not out loud, but as if the words themselves were a bridge to someone far away. "You would have smiled at this," he murmured, placing a pressed flower atop a pile of letters. "Would you have laughed at my foolishness? I hope so." His routine, rigid yet so tender, continued night after night. Even as the city whispered his name, as neighbors speculated and suspicion grew, Zephyr carried on, so completely unaware of the storm surrounding him. He didn't steal. He didn't intrude. He merely lived in the invisible realm of devotion, constructing a world for someone who might never walk through his door again. And yet, he never wavered. His patience, almost unnatural in its constancy, was the very thing that made him so mysterious. Harris, observing from a distance, felt a mixture of awe and sadness. He saw a man whose life was so utterly misinterpreted by the city, whose intentions had been twisted by wild rumor, yet whose heart remained so intact and so overflowing with a kind of love no one could ever see. Zephyr's obsession was not madness but love, a love that had endured, quietly, invisibly, beyond the reach of time and circumstance. The detective could sense it in the careful stacking of photographs, the neat rows of letters, the faint scent of paper and candle wax lingering in the air. It was a devotion that transcended ordinary understanding, a silent testament to the human capacity to care, to wait, and to hope. Yet the thefts continued. The city's treasures still vanished without a trace, and while Harris now understood Zephyr's innocence, he also knew that the true culprit remained out there, exploiting the pale man's enigmatic presence. Someone had used Zephyr's nightly rituals, his quiet obsession, as the perfect diversion, allowing crimes to unfold while the city watched the wrong person. Thought gnawed at Harris. He had seen the truth, yet the puzzle was not yet solved. Someone cleverer than either of them moved in the shadows. That night, Zephyr walked the familiar streets, suitcase in hand, pausing at the bridge over the river. The fog curled like smoke around the iron railings, and the city's lights shimmered dimly on the water. He whispered to himself again, words meant for no one but the woman whose presence lingered in every moment of his life. His figure moved slowly, deliberately, almost floating through the mist, a ghost tethered to memory, hope, and longing. Harris watched him, understanding fully for the first time that the man was a keeper of stories, a guardian of invisible love, and a silent witness to the city's painful misjudgments. Inside his apartment, Zephyr returned to the photographs and letters, touching each one gently, rearranging them, writing a few words in the notebook that lay always at hand. The candle burned low, casting trembling shadows that danced across the walls. He paused, staring at a single photograph, the woman's face frozen in a smile that had haunted him for years. "You could only know," he whispered, "how much of my life has been yours." And in that quiet, Harris realized that the mystery of Zephyr was not in crime, nor in shadow, nor in wild rumor. It was in the extraordinary human capacity to love silently, to wait, to construct a world for someone who might never return, and to persist despite misunderstanding and fear. The detective left the apartment that night with a new purpose. The real thief remained at large, and the city's nightmare had not yet ended. But he understood Zephyr now, and that understanding would guide him in uncovering the truth. Zephyr, for all his oddities and strangeness, was not a criminal, but a tragic, beautiful soul. A man whose heart had become a labyrinth of devotion, whose life had been a testament to love beyond expectation, and whose patience had created the perfect illusion for the real perpetrator to hide within. Chapter 6. The truth behind the shadows. The city had held its breath for weeks. Every street corner whispered the same question: who was behind the thefts? Detective Harris had followed Zephyr for nights on end, watched him pause, watched him move, and yet found nothing that proved his guilt. The pale man, silent and solitary, had become the perfect enigma, mysterious enough to inspire fear, strange enough to invite suspicion, but utterly innocent of the crimes that shook the city. The detective had come to respect Zephyr, even to feel a strange, quiet sympathy for him. His routines, his quiet devotion, his nightly walks with the suitcase, they were not signs of malice, but the gentle rhythms of a man, living for something unseen, something deeply personal. The breakthrough arrived completely unexpectedly. Harris had been reviewing surveillance footage from an unrelated alley, a street near one of the latest thefts, when he noticed a figure moving with purpose. It was not Zephyr. This man was younger, confident, careful, and completely unnoticed by anyone else. Harris watched as he slipped into a shadowed doorway carrying a small, nondescript bag. Later, when he compared this movement to the timing of the thefts, the pattern became crystal clear. The real thief had been operating in parallel, exploiting the city's fascination with Zephyr as a perfect diversion. The pale man's mysterious habits had created a smokescreen, a shadow under which the true criminal had moved freely. Harris organized surveillance on the new suspect, following him for days. The man had no conscience for the kind of beauty Zephyr had built. He was meticulous, efficient, and unflinching. In his van, the stolen objects were stacked so neatly, a treasure trove of the city's vanished valuables, paintings, jewels, rare books, and objects of immeasurable historical and sentimental value. Harris realized the genius behind the crime. All eyes had been on Zephyr. All suspicion had fallen on the wrong man, and the real culprit had hidden in plain sight, unnoticed, unjudged. Meanwhile, Zephyr's life continued quietly. The suitcase he carried during his nightly walks no longer contained secrets to fear, only reminders of devotion, letters, photographs, and poems meant for a woman whose memory defined his existence. He passed streets that had once whispered his name with suspicion. The neighbors' eyes unknowingly passed him without accusation. He didn't notice them, nor did he notice the detective's observation from the shadows that night. His mind was full of thoughts of her, the woman who had once lived across the courtyard, who had unknowingly inspired the devotion of a lifetime. Harris finally caught the real thief in the act. Under the dim glow of a streetlight, the man carried a stolen vase, completely unaware of the detective watching from behind a wall. Within minutes the man was arrested, the stolen items recovered, and the city breathed a collective sigh of relief. Zephyr, as always, remained so blissfully unaware of the resolution. For him, the world outside continued to revolve around quiet devotion and the memories of someone he loved. That evening, Harris returned to Zephyr's apartment, no longer as a detective suspecting a criminal, but as someone wishing to see the quiet man face to face and offer a kind of clarity. He found Zephyr arranging photographs and letters, carefully placing a single pressed flower atop a stack of notes. The detective spoke softly, almost hesitantly. "You weren't the one," he said. Zephyr looked up slowly, his eyes so calm, and nodded. No surprise. No relief. Only a quiet acknowledgement. A quiet acceptance that the world would always misunderstand him. Yet he would continue to live in his devotion, unchanged. The city resumed its rhythm. People whispered less, though Zephyr's legend still persisted. They no longer feared him, but they still didn't understand him, and perhaps they never would. To the detective, he was a man so remarkable in his constancy, obsessive in the most beautiful of ways, and misunderstood by all who had assumed the worst. The true thief had been caught, the crimes resolved, but Zephyr remained a mystery. A man who loved beyond understanding. A man whose devotion had been misread as malice. A man whose quiet life had provided the perfect camouflage for a shadowy genius operating elsewhere. And in that lingering quiet, Harris realized the final truth. Zephyr was not a criminal. Not a villain. Not a ghost of the city. He was a man whose heart had created an entire world, unseen and sacred for someone else. A devotion so profound it had fooled everyone, even the most diligent observer. The city had its solution, but Zephyr's story was far from over. Chapter 7. A chance encounter. The city had settled into the rhythm of normalcy. The thefts were solved, the real culprit caught, and the streets that once whispered suspicion now moved on, as if Zephyr had always been harmless. Yet the legend of the pale man with the suitcase persisted in quiet corners, told in murmurs by shopkeepers and neighbors who had once feared him. His presence was like a shadow in their memories. A figure both strange and so compelling. For years, the origin of his unusual nickname had remained a total mystery. No one knew why he was called Zephyr. Some assumed it was whimsical, a childlike moniker. Others believed it reflected some subtle personality trait. Only now, in the quiet aftermath of the city's crisis, did the truth emerge. Zephyr had been given the name by those who had known him long ago, colleagues and friends who noticed how he moved through life like a soft, unpredictable wind. He appeared and disappeared, often when he was least expected, leaving only the faintest impression behind, almost as if reality itself had shifted slightly in his passing. No one could predict him. No one could grasp him fully. And that mysterious, untouchable presence had earned him the name Zephyr. It was not mockery, nor irony. It was a recognition of a life lived so delicately, so invisibly, and with a quiet, powerful purpose. That afternoon, she returned to the city for work, having been away for years. She had once lived across the courtyard. A neighbor who had seen him only occasionally. A pale, silent man who seemed so absorbed in his own world. Life had taken her far away, to distant streets and crowded cities, and Zephyr had become a fading memory. A quiet curiosity she had once wondered about but never truly understood. On a gray afternoon, as she walked briskly toward her office, she nearly collided with someone turning the corner. It was him. Zephyr. He looked completely unchanged in appearance, yet so different in his presence. The long coat, the suitcase, the quiet gaze, all as familiar as a dream. She stopped, her heart quickening, unsure whether to speak or turn away. For a moment, they simply regarded each other, the city noise fading into a distant hum. You're here," she whispered, almost incredulous. Zephyr's lips curved in a small, almost shy smile. He didn't speak. Instead, he gestured lightly toward a nearby café, the motion subtle yet so deliberate, as if inviting her to step into his quiet world. The café smelled of coffee and old wood, dim light pooling across the tables. They sat across from each other, not speaking immediately, letting the minutes stretch between them. It was a comfortable, silent kind of tension. Slowly, she began to notice the signs of his devotion. A small notebook, open to reveal neatly written poems and reflections. Photographs carefully stacked, capturing fleeting moments of a life once shared, and now distant. Tiny handcrafted gifts, meticulously preserved. Each object told a story of patience and love. A devotion she had never, ever imagined. A life lived entirely for her. She realized with a sudden pang that Zephyr had spent years constructing an invisible world around her memory. A world so complete and tender that it had been mistaken for oddity or even menace. Her chest tightened. Awe, wonder, and something deeper, inspiration, filled her. She understood finally that the man she had once known so casually had been quietly extraordinary all along. And yet, there was no rush, no grand declaration, only the slow, gentle recognition of what had endured across time and distance. Zephyr's gaze met hers, calm and almost reverent, as if he had known this moment would come and waited patiently for it. The cafe door opened occasionally, bringing gusts of wind that fluttered the pages of the notebook. Outside, the city moved without notice of their small reunion, but inside, time seemed to bend. They exchanged no promises that afternoon, no immediate gestures of romance. Only shared understanding and the quiet acknowledgement of a bond that had always existed, patiently waiting. As she stepped back into the streets for her appointment, she glanced once more toward the café. Zephyr's figure receded into the dim light, suitcase in hand, walking with the calm assurance of someone who had lived years in silence and devotion. And in that brief intersection of their lives, something shifted. A spark. Subtle yet so undeniable. It hinted at the story yet to unfold. A romance still in the making, fragile and beautiful as the first whisper of wind through the city streets. And the name Zephyr, once so mysterious, now carried its full, beautiful meaning, a presence that could not be captured or confined. A quiet force that moved through life unseen, leaving its mark only on those who truly noticed, guiding fate with the gentlest touch. The city would continue its rhythm, the past would settle into memory. But for these two, a new chapter had begun, unspoken, delicate, and filled with promise.